The prairie wind carried a strange kind of silence across the land that evening, the kind that comes before something life-changing. The sun had slipped low, painting the horizon in streaks of red and gold, and the shadows stretched long across the earth. The small frontier town sat quiet, except for the restless murmurs inside the wooden church, where a gathering of townsfolk whispered with unease. Every eye kept drifting toward the girl standing at the front, pale hands clutched together, her figure trembling under the weight of what was about to happen. She was no more than 18, a virgin bride who had never known the world beyond her father's ranch, yet now she stood on the edge of a fate no one could have predicted. Her father's voice, stern and roughened by years of dust and hard work, filled the room with finality. The agreement had been struck. Comanche people had pressed against the edges of white settlements for years, and bloodshed had burned across the plains more than once. To keep peace, sacrifices had to be made, and this sacrifice wore a white dress sewn by her own mother's hands. She was to wed a young Comanche warrior, a man she had never spoken to, never even touched. The very thought of it sent a chill down her spine, though she held her head high, unwilling to let the townsfolk see her break. The warrior had not yet entered, but his presence could already be felt. Whispers traveled fast. They said he was strong, proud, and unyielding, with eyes as sharp as the hawk circling overhead. They said he was born to fight, raised in the old ways, and yet chosen by his people to take a bride as a bridge between two worlds that mistrusted each other. To the bride, he was nothing more than a stranger whose shadow loomed large over her life. To the town, he was the price of safety. To himself, perhaps he was something else entirely. The church smelled of pine, wood, and candle wax, yet beneath it lingered the heavy scent of fear. Women clutched their shawls tighter, men folded their arms as if bracing against the inevitable. And children hid behind their mothers, sensing the tension in the air. The bride could feel their eyes burning into her back, judging, pitying, and whispering what they dared not say aloud. She had been raised to be obedient, to trust her family, but inside her chest, her heart fought like a wild bird, battering against its cage. Was this truly the life she was meant for? To belong to a man from a world she did not understand? Outside, horses shifted restlessly, their hooves striking the earth as if echoing the unease inside. Then came the sound of approaching riders. The church doors swung open with a creak, and in stepped the Comanche delegation. At the front stood the young warrior. The lantern light caught the strong lines of his face, the long black hair tied back, the necklace of bone and turquoise resting against his bare chest. His stride was steady, his expression unreadable. Yet when his eyes met hers, she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with fear. It was a moment she would never forget. The gaze he held was not cruel, not mocking, not even cold. It was fierce, yes, but it carried a fire she could not name. Something deep inside her stirred, though she pushed it down, refusing to acknowledge the heat rising in her cheeks. She was supposed to resist, supposed to dread this union, yet something unspoken passed between them, and it rattled her to the bone. Her father stepped forward, placing a protective arm near her shoulder, as though shielding her from what was to come. But there was no turning back. The deal had been made, sealed not only by handshakes, but by the promise of peace. The warrior stopped just a few feet from her, his tall figure casting a shadow over her white dress. Now the crowd hushed, and the silence grew so thick she could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her mother's eyes glistened from the pew, her lips moving in silent prayer. The preacher's voice trembled as he spoke the words of union, his Bible clutched tightly in his hand, yet none of it reached the bride's ears. All she could hear was the steady, controlled breath of the man beside her, the one who was to become her husband. All she could see were those dark eyes locked upon her, holding her as if they had known her forever. The ceremony dragged like a slow march to the gallows. She answered when she was told, though her voice cracked and faltered. The warrior gave no outward sign of hesitation, his voice deep and steady as he accepted her. Each word he spoke felt heavy, as if it bound her tighter to him, even though they had not yet touched. When it was done, the people filed out, some relieved, some muttering, others shaking their heads. The bride stood frozen, her breath shallow, her thoughts spinning. She had imagined this moment would feel like an ending, but instead it felt like a beginning she was too frightened to name. The warrior did not move until the last of the townsfolk had cleared. Then, With slow certainty, he extended his hand toward her. The room seemed to shrink around her as she stared at that hand, strong tanned from the sun, scarred in places. It was nothing like the gentle hand she had once imagined in her childish dreams of marriage, yet it was steady, patient, waiting for her. Every fiber of her being screamed to resist, to hold fast to the life she knew. And still something inside her wavered, drawn toward him like a flame. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, but not crushing. The warmth of his skin startled her, sent her pulse racing in a way she could not explain. The world tilted slightly, and she had to steady herself. We gave no smile, no words, yet she felt the unspoken promise in that touch that her life was no longer her own, and yet perhaps it would not be the cage she feared. They stepped outside together. The night sky spread above them, stars glittering in the endless dark. The town watched from windows and doorways as the pair mounted horses, the bride behind him, her arms uncertainly circling his waist. The road ahead stretched into the wilderness, a land wild and untamed, a land that belonged to him and now, by marriage, to her as well. As the horses carried them away from the faint glow of the town, the bride's throat tightened. She looked back once, seeing her mother's figure in the doorway, small and fading into the distance. Ahead lay the unknown, a world where her survival rested in the hands of a man she barely knew. Fear pressed down heavy on her chest, yet alongside it came a spark she could not extinguish. The warrior glanced back at her, his expression calm, almost unreadable. But his eyes held a question she could not answer. Did he resent her as much as she feared? Or had he accepted her with the same strange inevitability she felt within herself? The night wrapped around them, the wilderness whispering secrets she was not yet ready to understand. The prairie stretched endless before them, and with each hoofbeat her heart raced faster. She was a virgin bride, forced into a marriage she had not chosen, yet something deep inside warned her that this journey would awaken desires she had never dared to imagine. The fear, the longing, the unspoken fire between them, it all burned together, unresolved, waiting for the moment it would break free. And so she rode into the night, caught between dread and desire, her fate sealed, yet her story only beginning, not knowing whether this union would destroy her spirit or change everything she had ever believed. The ride into the wilderness seemed endless, the rhythm of the horses' hooves drumming against the hard earth like a steady heartbeat. The bride clung to the warrior's waist, the unfamiliar closeness unsettling her, though she dared not loosen her grip. The night air was sharp, carrying scents of sage and dry grass, and the sky stretched wide, filled with stars she had never noticed back in town. Each mile carried her farther from everything she had known her home, her mother's gentle hands, her father's stern presence, and deeper into the world of the man before her. She had been told stories of the Comanche since childhood, stories meant to frighten, tales of raids and wild warriors who rode faster than the wind. Yet nothing in those tales had prepared her for the silent strength of the man now guiding her into his homeland. His presence was commanding, but not cruel. He spoke no words to her, and she dared not speak to him, the only sounds between them the rustle of wind and the occasional cry of a night bird. The silence was heavy, but it carried an odd kind of power, a reminder that this was no ordinary journey. This was a crossing from one life to another. Her thoughts turned back to the church, to the way the townsfolk had watched her with pity or relief. To them, she had become a symbol, a sacrifice for peace. No one had asked if she wanted this, if her heart longed for something different. In truth, she had once dreamed of love, of a husband chosen by affection rather than duty. She had pictured a life of quiet joys, of laughter shared by a warm hearth. Instead, she now rode into the unknown with a man whose name she had barely heard, whose world was as foreign to her as the far side of the prairie. The warrior's shoulders shifted slightly under her hands as he guided the horse along a narrow trail. The movement reminded her of his strength, the same strength that had frightened her when she first saw him, yet it now steadied her. She realized she was entrusting her life to him completely. If he wished to cast her aside, no one could stop him. If he chose to treat her with coldness, she would have to endure it. That knowledge should have filled her with dread, but instead it sparked a strange curiosity. What kind of man was he beneath the fierce exterior? Did he see her as nothing more than a bargain, or was there something more hidden in those dark eyes? The land around them grew wilder as the night wore on. Low hills rose in the distance, and the glow of fires flickered faintly along the horizon. Her breath caught as she realized they were nearing his camp. The thought of meeting his people filled her with both fear and anticipation. Would they accept her? Would they despise her for being different? She tightened her grip on the reins of her own emotions, trying to steady the pounding in her chest. At last the horses slowed. The camp came into view, scattered fires lighting up figures moving about with practiced ease. The air smelled of smoke and roasted meat, a scent far stronger than the faint meals she had known in her family's kitchen. Voices rose and fell, the Comanche tongue flowing like a river she could not understand. The warrior dismounted first, his movements fluid, and then turned to help her down. She hesitated, her legs stiff from the long ride, but when his hand closed around hers, she felt the same steady warmth she had felt in the church. It grounded her, even as she stepped into a world that was not her own. Eyes turned toward her immediately. Women paused in their tasks, children stared wide-eyed, and men watched with expressions she could not read. Some faces seemed curious, others suspicious, a few openly hostile. She kept her head slightly bowed, her hands clasped before her, aware that every gesture mattered. She had been taught to carry herself with dignity, and she clung to that now, even as unease tightened her throat. The warrior led her through the camp, his stride confident, hers careful and hesitant. He exchanged brief words with an older man whose bearing suggested authority. The man's gaze flicked to her, sharp and measuring, before he gave a slow nod. Whatever was spoken remained beyond her comprehension, yet she felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. Her fate was being decided not only by her new husband, but by the people he belonged to. She was shown to a tipi near the edge of the camp, its frame tall and sturdy, its painted designs glowing faintly in the firelight. Stepping inside, she was struck by the warmth and the smell of leather, earth, and smoke. The warrior motioned for her to sit while he set aside his belongings. The closeness of the space unsettled her, yet it was not unkind. Furs were spread neatly on the ground, and the firelight flickered against the walls, painting shadows that danced like restless spirits. She sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He moved with ease, as though this place was as natural to him as breathing. When he finally turned toward her, their eyes met again, and her breath caught. She expected anger or indifference, but what she saw was a quiet strength, a watchfulness that hinted he was studying her as much as she studied him. He did not speak, but his silence felt deliberate, as though he wanted her to sense rather than hear his intentions. The night stretched on, and though exhaustion tugged at her, she could not rest. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle outside the tipi, set her nerves on edge. She thought of her mother's voice, her father's stern words, the church filled with murmurs, and wondered if they were thinking of her now. Did they regret what they had asked of her, or had they already turned their thoughts elsewhere? She was no longer part of their world. That truth sank deeper with every passing moment. Morning came slowly, light seeping through the seams of the tipi. She woke to find the warrior already gone, though signs of his presence remained. A small bowl of food had been left near her, simple but thoughtful, and it made her pause. She realized he had considered her needs without a word, a small gesture that carried more weight than she could explain. Stepping outside, she saw the camp alive with activity. Women tended fires, men prepared horses, and children laughed as they chased each other. Yet when they noticed her, the laughter dimmed, the work slowed, and eyes followed her every step. She felt the divide clearly, a line drawn between who she was and who they were. She could not change her skin, her speech, or her upbringing, but perhaps she thought she could learn. As days passed, she began to watch closely. She observed the rhythm of their lives, the way respect flowed toward elders, the way the people moved as one. She noticed how her husband, though she still hesitated to think of him as such, commanded respect with few words. He carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone deeply rooted in his place. And she began to understand that his silence was not emptiness, but strength. Yet, despite the gradual understanding, unease still lingered. Some among his people resented her presence. She caught sharp glances, heard whispers she could not translate, and felt the weight of judgment pressing down. She knew acceptance would not come easily, perhaps not at all. and she knew that beneath the surface of peace between her town and his people, old wounds and suspicions still festered. Her nights remained restless. She would lie awake, listening to the steady breathing of the warrior nearby, her mind a storm of questions. Did he wish for this union any more than she did? Was he bound by duty just as she was? And why, when she dared to look at him too long, did something stir inside her? Something that frightened her more than fear itself? One evening, as the sky flamed with colors of another setting sun, she stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the endless prairie. The horizon stretched wide, vast and untamed, and she realized it mirrored her own heart, frightening, uncertain, but alive with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. She heard footsteps behind her, steady and certain, and she knew without turning that it was him. The air between them grew heavy, charged with something unspoken. She did not move, nor did he. The silence pressed around them, filled with questions neither had the courage to voice. And in that stillness, standing between two worlds, she realized her life had only just begun to change, in ways neither of them could yet understand. The wind rose, carrying the scent of earth and smoke, and she felt a shiver run through her. This was no ordinary path she had been forced onto. It was a road that could lead to ruin, or to something far more powerful than fear. She did not yet know which it would be. But she knew that every step forward would bind her closer to the warrior who now stood at her side, silent and watchful, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. Life in the Comanche camp slowly revealed itself to the bride, though never in a way that felt safe or familiar. Each day tested her spirit. She learned that the people rose before the sun, their work beginning while the sky was still gray. Women tended the fires, mended hides, and cared for the children. Men sharpened their weapons, prepared their horses, and rode out into the open land with eyes always scanning the horizon. She watched quietly, trying to blend in, though she could feel the weight of stares that never quite softened. Some faces held curiosity, others suspicion, and a few carried open hostility. Her husband remained steady, never raising his voice nor showing frustration, but his silence was a constant puzzle. He treated her with respect, never forcing words or gestures. Yet she could not shake the sense that he was guarding something deep inside. Sometimes she caught him watching her, his dark eyes unreadable, as though he too was trying to understand who she was and why fate had bound them together. That gaze unsettled her, yet at the same time it drew her in, stirring questions she dared not voice. The greatest conflict lay in the space between two worlds. Her town had surrendered her as a token of peace, but peace was a fragile promise. Rumors drifted in on the wind whispers of other settlers breaking agreements, of Comanche raids striking back in anger, of blood spilled in the grasslands. She could feel the tension pressing against the edges of the camp, a storm waiting to break. And she knew that if war returned, she would stand trapped in the center, torn between the family she had left behind and the people she now lived among. One afternoon, she overheard a heated discussion between the older man she had first seen upon arrival and several younger warriors. Though she did not understand the words, the tone was sharp, the gestures fierce. Their glances flicked toward her more than once, and she understood enough. To them, she was not just a stranger, she was a risk. If trust in her failed, if her presence brought misfortune, she could easily become the scapegoat. The realization settled like a stone in her stomach, heavy and cold. In the days that followed, she tried to find her place among the women. She offered to help with small tasks, carrying water or gathering wood. Some accepted her silently, others turned away. One woman, close to her age, studied her with an expression that mixed curiosity with a kind of restrained anger. Their eyes met often, and though no words passed between them, the bride felt certain this woman had once imagined she might become the warrior's wife. The unspoken rivalry cut deeper than she expected. Every time she caught the woman's gaze, she felt the weight of judgment, as though she had stolen something that was never meant to be hers. Her nights brought no peace either. She would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the camp, the soft laughter of families, the murmur of conversations in a language she could not understand. And then she would hear the steady breath of the warrior beside her, his presence so close and yet so distant. Sometimes she wondered if he was awake too, lying in silence, caught in the same questions that plagued her. Did he see her as an intruder? Did he resent the union as much as she feared he might? or was there something else hidden beneath his calm exterior? One evening, a small group of townsfolk arrived at the camp under a flag of truce. The bride's heart nearly stopped when she recognized one of the riders as her older brother. His face was drawn, his eyes sharp with worry. He dismounted stiffly, his gaze darting to her, and though he gave no outward sign, she could feel the storm behind his eyes. When their paths briefly crossed, he whispered low enough that only she could hear, "We haven't forgotten you. This isn't over." Those words shook her more than she wanted to admit. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but there was no chance. The meeting between the Comanche leaders and the townsfolk remained tense. Every word carefully measured, every glance sharp as a blade. When the visitors finally departed, her brother's eyes lingered on her one last time before he spurred his horse away. She stood frozen, torn between relief that he had come and fear of what his words might mean. That night, she sat by the fire outside the tipi, watching sparks rise into the dark sky. Her husband joined her, sitting silently at her side. For a long time, neither spoke. Then he turned slightly, his gaze fixed on her face, and for the first time since their marriage, he spoke her name aloud. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of unspoken meaning. She startled, the sound of her name and his voice striking her heart like an arrow. He said nothing more, but in that single word, she felt both a warning and a promise. The following days grew tense. Riders came and went from the camp more often, their faces grim. She heard the older men discussing matters in urgent tones, and though she could not understand the language, she sensed the danger. The uneasy peace between the Comanche and the settlers trembled like glass ready to shatter. If war broke out again, she knew she would be pulled apart, caught between loyalty to her blood and the bond forced upon her. As the conflict deepened, so too did the subtler struggles. The young woman who had watched her with such intensity grew bolder. She would pass close by, her eyes sharp with challenge, her posture rigid. Once, when the bride bent to draw water, the woman brushed past her roughly, murmuring words she did not understand but whose meaning was clear in the tone. It was not only the fear of war that threatened, hurt was also the silent battles inside the camp itself. Yet even in the tension, she began to notice moments that unsettled her heart in new ways. When she stumbled carrying a heavy bundle of wood, it was her husband who appeared silently, lifting the weight with ease. When she grew frustrated by her clumsy attempts to mimic the women's work, he watched quietly, his expression unreadable, yet he did not mock her. In those small gestures, she saw something unexpected, a patience she had not imagined. And against her will, that patience began to stir feelings she tried desperately to push aside. The days stretched long, each one carrying its own shadows. At night, she found herself studying him when he did not notice, her eyes tracing the strength in his hands, the calm way he moved. She hated herself for the warmth rising in her chest, for the way her thoughts wandered in directions she dared not speak. She had been forced into this marriage, bound against her will, and yet her heart was betraying her, awakening to something she could neither understand nor control. The true conflict was no longer just between two peoples. It was inside her own heart, where fear and longing battled endlessly. She could not deny the growing spark, yet she feared it as much as she feared rejection. The future remained uncertain, danger closing in from both sides. And the bond between her and the warrior deepened with every glance, every unspoken word. One night, as the fire burned low and the camp lay wrapped in uneasy quiet, she found herself standing at the edge of the prairie, staring out into the darkness. The wind carried whispers of war, the echoes of choices she could not escape. Behind her, she heard his footsteps, steady and sure. He stopped a breath away, and though he said nothing, she felt his presence like a force against her back. Her heart raced, caught between fear and desire, between the life she had lost and the life she was still too afraid to claim. The night seemed to hold its breath with her, the future suspended in shadows. She knew the moment of truth was drawing near. But whether it would bring ruin or something far more dangerous, she could not yet tell. The prairie stretched before her, vast and merciless, the same land that had taken so much, and yet promised something fierce and untamed. Somewhere within its silence, the answer waited, and she knew it would test every part of her spirit before it revealed itself. The days turned heavier with each sunrise, as though the very air around the camp had thickened with dread. Rumors came and went like restless winds, carried by riders who returned with sharp words and grim faces. Settlers had pushed farther into Comanche hunting grounds, breaking the fragile line that had been drawn in uneasy agreement. In answer, small bands of warriors had struck back, swift and merciless. The bride felt the tension in every corner of the camp, in the hurried movements of the women, in the fierce glances of the men, in the silence that stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. She tried to keep herself small, to stay out of the way, but the truth was, she could never truly blend in. Her pale dress had been replaced by garments of buckskin, her hair braided in the fashion of the women around her, yet no change of clothing could alter the fact that she was an outsider. She was reminded of it with every glance that lingered too long, with every hushed word she could not understand but knew was about her. Even the children, curious at first, now played at a distance, as though sensing the unease their parents carried. The warrior remained a steady figure in the chaos, but his quiet grew heavier, his eyes sharper, shoulders tense as if carrying a weight too great to bear. He rode out more often with other men, his return always shadowed by silence. She wanted to ask him what he had seen, what news he carried, but the words never found her lips. The space between them grew thick with what neither dared to say. One evening, she caught sight of her husband speaking with the older man of authority, their voices low but urgent. When they parted, the warrior's face was hard, unreadable, but his hands clenched briefly at his sides before he walked away. She sensed something had been decided, something dangerous, and the knot of fear inside her tightened. That night, as she sat by the fire, the young woman who had always watched her approached. Her eyes glowed with something sharp, not just resentment, but warning. She spoke a few words in a low voice, and though the bride could not understand them, the tone left no room for doubt. Trouble was coming. The woman's gaze flicked to the warrior's tent, then back to her, as though daring her to face what lay ahead. The bride's hands shook when she lifted them from her lap, and for the first time she realized she was as much a part of the conflict as the warriors who sharpened their spears. The following morning brought her no peace. Riders from her town had been spotted near the river, too close for comfort. She overheard whispers that her people were preparing something, perhaps even gathering others to strike. The knowledge left her torn in two. If the settlers attacked, her brother would likely be among them. The Comanche struck first, the blood spilled might very well belong to her own kin. She could not escape the truth that no matter the outcome, her heart would be shattered. Her husband sensed her unrest. That night when they sat in the quiet of the tipi, he broke his silence with a single question, his voice low, roughened with something she could not name. He asked if she feared him. The words startled her so deeply she nearly forgot to breathe. She shook her head slowly, though her heart raced. She did not fear him as she once had. What she feared now was the storm rising outside, and the way her heart leapt when he drew near. Their eyes held for a long moment, and in that space something shifted between them. She wanted to speak, to tell him she did not know where she belonged anymore, but the words tangled in her throat. He reached toward her then, not to grasp, but simply to let his hand rest lightly against hers. The warmth of his skin lit something inside her, something fragile and fierce, all at once. Before she could draw breath, he let go and turned away, leaving her heart pounding in the silence. The camp grew restless, as the moon thinned to a sliver in the sky. Warriors gathered in council fires, their voices rising in anger and resolve. She listened from the shadows, unable to make sense of the language but feeling the heat of their words in her bones. The young woman who despised her lingered nearby, eyes flashing like a storm, as though she knew a reckoning was close. The bride could no longer pretend that her marriage was simply a union of peace. It had become a fragile thread holding together two worlds on the brink of tearing apart. One night, her sleep was broken by distant shouts and the thunder of hooves. She rushed outside to find men returning, their faces grim, their weapons bloodied. Her stomach dropped when she realized a skirmish had already broken out near the river. The air filled with the sharp cries of the wounded, the low murmurs of women rushing to tend to them. She stood frozen, her body cold despite the fire blazing high. This was no longer rumor. War had already begun. Her husband returned later, dust and sweat marking his skin, his jaw tight with unspoken rage. She stepped forward without thinking, reaching as though to steady him, but stopped when his eyes met hers. In them, she saw not just the warrior, but the weight of a man torn between duty and something unspoken. He said nothing, but she could feel the storm in him, the same storm that was tearing her apart. In the days that followed, both sides prepared. Scouts reported settlers moving in greater numbers, while the Comanche gathered their strength. Tension wrapped around the camp like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap. She began to notice small changes in her husband. He watched her more often, his gaze longer, heavier. When she faltered with her work, he would appear silently, lending his strength. When others looked at her with suspicion, his presence at her side was enough to hold their judgment at bay. Slowly, she realized he was not just her husband by agreement, he was becoming her shield, even as the danger grew closer. But the danger was not only outside. The young woman's bitterness deepened, her words sharper, her glances like knives. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the woman approached the bride openly, spoke in halting English, her voice rough but clear enough to understand. "You bring trouble? He belongs to our people, not to you." The bride's throat closed, her body trembling, but she held her ground. She had no words to defend herself, no way to explain that she had never asked for this life. Yet as the woman's eyes burned into hers, she realized the truth. The rivalry was not simply about marriage, it was about belonging, about the threat she represented to a way of life already under siege. The encounter left her shaken, but it also steeled something inside her. She could no longer remain silent, a shadow moving between two worlds. She would have to find her voice, though the thought terrified her. She could not stop the war rising around them, but she could not let herself be swallowed whole by it either. The next night, the warrior returned late, his body weary, his expression harder than she had ever seen. He sat beside her in the tipi, the firelight flickering across his face. She wanted to reach for him, to break through the silence, but before she could speak, he said her name again. The sound of it held more weight this time, heavy with the truth they had both tried to ignore. Her heart pounded as his eyes locked on hers, the air between them charged with everything unsaid. Before either could move, a horn sounded in the distance, sharp and urgent. The camp erupted in motion, warriors rushing to arms, women gathering children. The bride's body turned cold as she realized what the sound meant. The settlers were coming. Her brother might already be among them, riding with fury, ready to bring fire and blood. She felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, the thunder of hooves approaching. The warrior rose swiftly, his hand gripping his weapon, his eyes burning with determination. He glanced back at her once, and in that look was both a promise and a farewell. She wanted to cry out, to beg him not to go, but the words lodged in her throat. She could only watch as he disappeared into the chaos, leaving her standing in the firelight, her heart torn between two worlds about to collide. The night filled with the clash of steel, the cries of men, the thunder of horses. She stood frozen at the edge of the camp, the flames casting long shadows, the air heavy with smoke and fear. Her body shook, her breath caught in her chest, as the war she had dreaded became real before her eyes. And somewhere in the madness, her brother and her husband would face each other, one carrying her past, the other holding her future, neither willing to surrender. The moment she had feared most had come. The world she knew was unraveling, and her heart, caught between blood and bond, would soon be forced to choose. The night after the storm. The land seemed to breathe easier, as if the earth itself had exhaled after holding too much weight. The fires that had threatened the village were put out by the pouring rain, and the Comanche camp slowly returned to its steady rhythm. But inside the heart of the young woman who had once been dragged there against her will, nothing was simple. She stood on the edge of a new beginning, one that frightened her almost as much as it gave her hope. The world had turned upside down since the day she was forced to marry a young Comanche warrior, and yet she could no longer call him a stranger. He had become the center of her confusion, the reason she could not sleep without wondering what tomorrow might bring. In the early hours, as the sky was still painted with streaks of silver and lavender, she walked outside the lodge and watched the horses grazing. Her mind drifted to her family, the home she had left behind, and the quiet life she thought she would have. She wondered if her parents still cried at night, not knowing where she was, or if they had hardened their hearts and assumed she was gone for good. That thought made her ache, but then her gaze shifted to where the Comanche warrior stood near the horses, his figure proud and steady, even in silence. She realized her heart was torn between two worlds that could never fully meet. He had once been the one she feared most, but now she had seen him risk his life for hers, had felt his hand steady her when she wanted to collapse, and had heard the low comfort of his voice when she doubted she had the strength to keep going. Desire had crept in like an ember, warming the coldest corners of her spirit until she no longer knew what was real and what was a dream. She wanted to hate him still, to push him back into the shadows of an enemy, but her heart betrayed her every time his dark eyes found hers. The days that followed tested them both. Traders passed near the land, spreading rumors of soldiers pushing deeper west. Whispers reached the Comanche camp of raids, of cattle stolen and women taken, of a storm of blood gathering on the horizon. The elders debated whether to move farther into the hills or stand and defend their territory. The young men sharpened their weapons, and the women prepared what little they could carry in case the order came to leave. Among the tension, she could feel her place shifting. No longer just an outsider, she was being watched with different eyes, as if the people waited to see which side she would choose when the moment came. One evening, she found herself near the river, the sound of rushing water hiding her restless thoughts. The warrior came to stand beside her, his presence strong but not demanding. For a long while, they said nothing. Then he spoke, his words heavy with meaning. He told her that a choice would come soon, one that no elder, no family, and no spirit could make for her. She would have to decide where she belonged. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of that truth. Her chest tightened, for she already knew what choice he meant. She could try to run, to find her way back to the world she came from, or she could stay here with him and face whatever storms the future carried. The thought frightened her, not because she did not know what she wanted, but because she did. That desire was the very thing that had changed everything, the fire she could not put out no matter how she tried. The tension between them grew heavier each day. At night, she lay awake, listening to the sounds of the camp, hearing drums in the distance or the whinny of restless horses, but her mind was always filled with him. During the day, when she helped with the women, or learned to ride under his watchful eye, her heart leaped with every glance he gave her. Yet she never spoke the words that tangled inside her. She feared that once spoken, there would be no turning back. Then the soldiers came. The first smoke on the horizon sent the camp into chaos. Men readied for battle, women gathered children in bundles, and the ground shook with the stampede of frightened horses. She stood in the middle of it all, her heart racing. The warrior rushed to her side, his grip firm as he guided her toward safety, but she pulled back. She would not hide, not this time. She had lived through fear long enough, and now she knew her place was at his side. The clash that followed was brutal, with gunfire tearing through the silence of the plains. The warrior fought with a fire that burned through every strike, and she watched him from the edge, praying with all her soul that he would not fall. At one point, soldiers came too close, and she found herself face to face with the danger she had always feared. But in that moment, courage filled her, and she stood firm. Her scream alerted the warrior, who turned in time to protect her, but she knew in her heart that she had already chosen. When the battle ended, and the survivors gathered under the broken sky, she stood with him, their shoulders brushing, their breaths ragged. The camp had endured loss, and grief hung heavy in the air, yet she felt a strange calm settle over her. The choice was no longer just a thought in her mind. It was real, and it was alive in every beat of her heart. In the days that followed, the people began to heal, and the land slowly quieted again. She worked beside the women, her hands rougher now, her spirit steadier. The warrior moved among his people, his presence a pillar of strength, yet his gaze always found hers. At night, when the fires burned low, she felt no longer like a prisoner. She was part of something larger, a bond forged in fear, in loss, and in desire. When she thought of the home she had left behind, she still felt sorrow, but it no longer held her as it once did. Her heart had been reshaped by a love she had never expected, a love that had grown out of fire and shadows until it was stronger than the walls she had built around herself. She knew that if she ever returned to her old life, she would never be the same. Standing one evening on the ridge, the wind in her hair and the vast plains stretching endlessly before her, she understood the journey that had brought her here. She had been taken, forced into a union she never wanted, and yet through it all, she had found not only courage, but a new meaning of home. The Comanche warrior at her side was no longer the stranger who had once terrified her. He was the man who had changed her life, the one she had come to trust, and the one who had awakened a desire that bound them together in ways neither could deny. The world beyond the horizon would always be uncertain, filled with danger and change, but she was no longer afraid of it. She had walked through fear, endured loss, and found love where she least expected it. Whatever the future held, she knew she was ready. The virgin bride who had once been forced to wed had become a woman who chose her own path. And that choice was made not with fear, but with strength and devotion. And so, the story closed on a camp recovering, a land scarred but enduring, and a love that had risen from the ashes of conflict. It was not the ending she had imagined when her journey began, but it was the one her heart had fought for. Desire had changed everything, and in that truth, she finally found her freedom.